I worked corrections for 9 years. I am not someone who startles easily, and I am not telling you this story to entertain you. I am telling it because it happened, because I have told almost no one, and because the version of it I've held inside my own head for 6 years has started to feel heavier than I can carry alone. Pembroke State Penitentiary was built in 1931. The original East Wing, Block D, was decommissioned in 1987 due to structural concerns, but never demolished. The administration used it for storage. The lights in Block D ran on a separate circuit that had not been fully rewired with the rest of the facility. They flickered. They always flickered. My first assignment to Block D was in March, 6 years into my tenure. Routine inventory check. I was told it would take 40 minutes. I went in alone because the officer originally partnered with me had called out sick that morning, and the shift supervisor didn't consider it worth reassigning. Block D smelled like concrete and old water. The cells along the walls still had their original fixtures: steel bunks bolted to the floor, shelf brackets, narrow windows at the top that let in gray strips of afternoon light. The storage was piled in the center corridor: stacked crates, folded equipment, bundled cable. I worked my way down the checklist with a flashlight and a clipboard, and for the first 20 minutes there was nothing unusual about it. Cell 11 was near the far end of the block. I noticed it from several cells away. The door was open. They were all open. It was a decommissioned block, but the interior of Cell 11 was darker than the others. Not because of any physical difference I could identify. The same narrow window sat at same height. The same flat light filtered in. But the inside of that cell looked darker. Like the light that entered it traveled slightly less far. I stood in the doorway for a moment, checking my clipboard. Cell 11 wasn't on the inventory. Nothing was stored there. I had no reason to go inside. I went inside. The cold hit me before anything else. Not a draft. Pembroke was drafty throughout, and I knew what a draft felt like. This was different. This was a stillness that was cold, as if the air in the cell had not moved in a very long time and had cooled accordingly. I swept my flashlight across the walls. Standard cell, nothing unusual. I was about to turn around. Then I heard the sound. It was low, rhythmic. It took me several seconds to identify it because my brain kept sliding off the correct interpretation, the way your eye slides off something it doesn't want to accept. When I finally understood what I was hearing, my hand tightened on the flashlight. It was breathing, slow, measured, coming from the rear corner of the cell. I turned the flashlight toward the corner. The beam swept across the far wall, the bunk brackets, the floor. Nothing, no one. The sound continued for 2 more cycles. In, out, and then stopped. The cold did not stop. I left the cell. I finished the inventory check in the remaining cells without looking back at Cell 11. I wrote in my report that the block was accounted for and nothing was out of order. I did not mention the cold. I did not mention the sound. I told myself both had explanations I hadn't located yet. I was assigned to Block D twice more over the following year. The second time, I went during a day shift with a partner, Officer Reyes, who had been at Pembroke for 12 years. "We moved efficiently," said Little. When we reached Cell 11, Reyes stopped outside the door without being prompted. He stood there for a moment, not looking at me. Then he said quietly that he always skipped that one. I asked him why. He said that in his 12 years, 4 officers had reported hearing things in Block D that they couldn't explain. That one of them had put in for a transfer the next day and never said specifically why. That 2 others had simply refused to go back in and had accepted the disciplinary write-up without discussion. He said the old-timers called it the 11th cell problem. He didn't say it like he believed in anything. He said it like a man reporting a persistent maintenance issue he'd stopped expecting to be fixed. The 3rd time I went to Block D was my last. It was a February overnight. A supply discrepancy had been flagged and needed to be resolved before the morning count. I went alone again. I moved fast. I had my list and I intended to finish it and leave. I was halfway down the corridor when the lights in Block D went out entirely. Not a flicker. Off. The separate circuit had tripped before. It was old wiring. It happened occasionally. I switched on my flashlight and kept moving. I did not look towards cell 11. I found the discrepancy in the crates near the center of the block, noted it on my clipboard, and turned to leave. There was a man standing at the far end of the corridor. I trained my flashlight on him immediately. He was standing completely still, facing me at the entrance to cell 11. He was wearing what appeared to be the gray uniform of an older era, not the current issue, not any decade I'd worked in. He was not tall, not short. His face was in shadow. He did not move when the flashlight hit him. I called out, identified myself as a corrections officer, told him to stay where he was. He took 1 step backward into cell 11. I followed the protocol. I radioed for backup. I waited at the center of the corridor with my flashlight on the cell doorway. Backup arrived in 4 minutes. We swept the block together, every cell, every corner. Cell 11 was empty. The block was empty. There was no other exit. My supervisor asked me to write a detailed account. I did. He read it, thanked me, and filed it. I never worked Block D again. Not because I requested a reassignment. I didn't. It simply never appeared on my rotation. Whether that was a coincidence or a quiet administrative decision, I genuinely don't know. I left Pembroke 2 years later for a different facility. I've had a long time to think about what I saw at the end of that corridor. I don't reach for supernatural explanations easily. 9 years in corrections will do that to you. You see enough real horror that the invented kind stops holding its shape. But I have never been able to account for the man who stepped backward into an empty cell. And I have never gone looking for an explanation, because I suspect the looking would cost me something I'm not prepared to pay. I was 22 years old the first time I went to prison. I know how that sounds. I know what you're imagining. I was caught with possession, a small amount, nothing dramatic, in a state with strict mandatory minimums. The judge gave me 14 months. The intake process at Hargrove Correctional took the better part of a day. They photographed you, catalogued you, stripped everything away that reminded you of the world outside. By the time they walked me to my assigned block, I was carrying a thin mattress, 2 gray blankets, and a plastic bag with a bar of soap and a toothbrush. The fluorescent lights above never fully brightened. They buzzed at a frequency I felt more than heard. My cell was on the 2nd tier. 8 feet by 10 feet, 2 bunks, a steel toilet, a shelf bolted to the wall. My cellmate was already there when the door opened. He was lying on the bottom bunk with his arm draped over his eyes, and he didn't move when I came in. He said his name was Garrett. He told me he had the bottom bunk, and I was welcome to the top, and that he liked quiet in the mornings and didn't care what I did otherwise. Garrett kept to himself. He read paperback thrillers and played cards in the common area and said very little. He was in his mid-40s, lean, with close-cropped grey hair and pale eyes that didn't blink quite as often as they should. He began asking questions. He asked what my mother did for work. He asked which high school I'd attended. He asked, casually, the way you'd ask about the weather, whether I had younger siblings still living at home. I answered vaguely. He didn't push. He just nodded slowly, like my answer had confirmed something he already suspected. One night, I woke to the sound of movement. The cell block was on its overnight cycle. Lights dimmed, but never off. The distant sound of someone coughing down the tier. I opened my eyes and looked down from the top bunk. Garrett was sitting up on his mattress, not moving, just sitting in the grey light, facing the wall. But the next morning, he told me he'd slept well. By week 5, Garrett had stopped pretending the questions were casual. He asked me one evening if I'd ever told anyone where I kept my things at home. Not what I kept. Where? He smiled. Not warmly, but with patience, as if I were a child struggling with an obvious lesson, and said it didn't matter. I started sleeping facing the wall with one ear open. There was a corrections officer named Dawes who did the overnight rounds. I asked him once, obliquely, how I might go about requesting a cell transfer. He looked at me for a long moment and then said the wait list was several months long and I'd need documented cause. I didn't have documented cause. I had a feeling. You cannot file paperwork on a feeling. I had been asleep, genuinely, deeply asleep for the first time in weeks when something pulled me up out of it. I lay still on my back on the top bunk, staring at the ceiling. The block was quiet, and then I became aware, slowly and with absolute certainty, that someone was standing at the side of my bunk. Not climbing up, not reaching, just standing close enough that I could hear breathing that was not my own. I turned my head. Garrett was standing beside the bunk in the half-dark, looking up at me. Not with aggression, not with anger. He was just watching. His pale eyes caught the low light from the corridor. He had been standing there long enough that his eyes had adjusted. I said his name. He said, very quietly, that he didn't mean to wake me. Then he walked back to his bunk and lay down. I reported it the next morning. I told the duty officer exactly what had happened. To his credit, he documented it. Within 48 hours, I was moved to a single occupancy cell at the end of the block. On the walkover, one of the older inmates I'd spoken with occasionally told me that Garrett had been there 11 years, that his original cellmates had all been transferred within months. He lowered his voice and said that one of them had been transferred to a psych ward in the county facility and wouldn't talk about why. I served the rest of my time without incident. When I was released 14 months later, I took a bus home. I was something harder to name, a feeling like I'd stood very close to an edge. I hadn't been able to see clearly until I'd stepped back from it. I never found out what Garrett was in for. I looked, eventually. The records were sealed. Some nights I'm glad for that. Other nights, not knowing is its own kind of weight. The first thing you need to understand is that I am not someone who panics. I spent 11 years working as a registered nurse in a trauma unit. I have seen things that would end most people's sleep permanently. I am practical and I am composed. And when this began, I told myself it was explainable. I am telling you this so that when I say I was genuinely terrified, you understand what that means coming from me. I served 8 months at Dalton Women's Correctional after a DUI charge that involved an accident. I was assigned to a cell in Unit 3. My cellmate was a woman named Rosalind who had been at Dalton for 2 years. On a fraud conviction, the part that was not manageable was a woman on our unit named Petra. Petra had been at Dalton for 6 years. She had a reputation I learned about through the natural channels of a prison unit, cautiously, in fragments, from women who spoke in low voices and rarely elaborated. What I gathered was that Petra was intelligent in an unsettling way, and that she had a history of identifying things about the women around her that she should have had no way of knowing. Not guesses, not cold readings, specific, accurate, unaccountable knowledge. I dismissed this as prison mythology. Every facility has its legends. Petra introduced herself to me during my second week. She sat across from me in the common room during the afternoon recreation hour, placed her hands flat on the table, and said she was glad to finally meet the nurse from St. Clair Memorial. I had not told anyone I was a nurse. I had not mentioned St. Clair Memorial. I had spoken to almost no one about my life outside the facility. I told her she must have me confused with someone else. She smiled and said she didn't think so. I returned to my cell, and I told myself there was a rational explanation. Someone had talked. My paperwork had been visible at some point. 3 days later, Petra asked me how my daughter was adjusting to the new school. My daughter was 7 years old. Her name is Mara. I had told no one in that facility any of this. My hands went cold. I kept my face neutral. Years of trauma nursing had given me a face I could hold steady through nearly anything. She tilted her head slightly and said she hoped Mara was settling in well. She said the first few months in a new place were always the hardest for children. Then she picked up her book and went back to reading, as if she had said nothing of significance. I went to the unit counselor that afternoon. I reported the interaction in careful, clinical language. She said Petra had a complicated file and that I should limit my interactions with her. That was the extent of the institutional response. The interactions continued. Not frequently. That was the most disorienting thing about them. Petra did not approach me daily or behave obsessively. She would go 10, 12 days without speaking to me at all. And then, in a moment I couldn't predict, she would say something that stripped another layer of the wall I was trying to maintain. She asked about my mother's health. My mother had been diagnosed with a cardiac condition 6 weeks before my arrest and had told almost no one. She referenced, by first name, a colleague I had worked closely with at St. Clair who had recently retired. She asked me once, very gently, whether I had ever forgiven myself for the accident. It wasn't what she said. It was the tone of it, the precision of the wound she was pressing, and the care with which she pressed it. I served the remainder of my sentence without resolution. Petra was never formally sanctioned for anything connected to me. I was released on a Thursday morning in November. My mother picked me up. It was raining. For the first several months, I worked on rebuilding the things that needed rebuilding. Mara, my sobriety, the shape of a normal day. I told myself Petra was behind a wall somewhere and could not touch the life I was putting back together. 4 months after my release, I received a letter. It had been forwarded through 3 addresses before reaching me. Inside was a single index card. On it, in neat small handwriting, were 4 words, "Mara looks like you." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. I called the facility. I was told Petra was still incarcerated, had another 4 years on her sentence. and had not been granted any outside communication privileges. The administrator I spoke with was sympathetic and careful, and ultimately unable to tell me how it had happened. I filed a report. I changed my address again. I enrolled Mara in after-school care that ensured she was never unaccompanied between school and home. The letter came from somewhere inside a wall. It found me anyway. I have not received another one. It has been 2 years. I tell myself that means it's over. Most mornings I almost believe it. But some nights I wake at 3 in the morning to the sound of nothing. Just the house settling, just the dark. And I go down the hall and I open Mara's door and I stand there until I'm sure she's breathing. And I think about how Petra said her name before I ever told anyone she existed. I think about that, and I leave the light on in the hallway, and I don't go back to sleep.